The question, what is art, is perhaps one of the most cliché questions in the philosophy of art. It's been studied in countless monographs, journals, and other literature. I'm sure some come to mind right now. The question, which is considered much less often, but which is just as important, is who gets to decide what is art? One could assume that each author who writes a paper is asserting themselves as the authority, but that's not always the case. Sometimes an author argues on behalf of some other authority, and sometimes they argue that there's no singular authority whatsoever. Often, these assertions are not explicitly stated, but are implicit in the arguments they make about the art, or in the overarching frameworks they use to anchor their arguments. It's possible that some authors are not even aware that they're taking a stance on the issue, or at the very least, are not considering it critically. Broadly speaking, we can divide the various theories of art into two categories. Objective theories, which say that what is and is not art is a matter of fact, and subjective theories, which claim that some or all of the value of art comes from the assessment of the viewer. This is not to say that these two perspectives are mutually exclusive, however. As I argue in my paper, Art as Harmony and Wholeness, there's at least one tenable view in which an art object has both objective value as art and subjective value. There are also what I have called in my research quasi-objective and quasi-subjective paradigms, which primarily take the shape of one or the other side, but which are neither wholly objective nor wholly subjective in their details. Let's take a look and unpack some of the most common approaches. Under the umbrella of objective valuations of art, there are two broad categories and a few miscellaneous theories which fall outside of either of their purview. All of these attempt to define what is and isn't art based on criteria that are a function of the art object itself. First, we have the metaphysical approaches which say that an object is or isn't art based on something that the art object is. Sometimes, this means that an object is seen as art when it acts as a representation of some ideal form of art. Other times, it means that a work is considered art when it embodies certain formal properties of color, contrast, or proportion. Second, we have teleological approaches. These approaches can vary, but all of them place artistic value on an object or work based on something the object does. For some views, art is that which embodies beauty and is generally beautiful. For others, a work is art when it represents an authentic expression of religion or of emotion, and for yet others, we rightly call something art when it provides valuable social critique. The other objective approaches require a little more exposition to understand fully, but to present them here briefly, there are also the axiological theory, which values a work of art if it aligns with the values of the artist, the aesthetic creative theory, which says that an object is art if it was created to be art, the historical theory, which says that in order to be art, a work must sufficiently resemble previously established art, and the structural theory, which says that something is art if it belongs to an art, such as sculpture, music, dance, or so on. In general, objective approaches to the question of artistic authority are easy to understand. They are stable and unambiguous. However, this is not to say they are perfect. If there is a correct view of which objects are art and which aren't, this means by necessity that some people are wrong about art. Quasi-objective approaches attempt to reconcile this apparent incongruity by bringing in a human element to the assessment of art, but without abandoning things entirely to a subjective way of thinking. They rely on the consensus of a qualified individual or group to decide what is art, and these valuations, then, are the correct ones. Depending on the exact formulation of these theories, the authority determining what is and isn't art can either be God, or a God, the artist who created the work, a group of knowledgeable individuals or experts in the art world, or society as a whole. Again, these approaches are fairly intuitive to the layperson, and in fact, more so than some of the wholly objective approaches, because they take the burden of proof off of the individual. However, they still admit of some of the same issues as we saw before. Individuals can still be wrong about art if their intuitions or evaluations do not match those of the authority. It's possible to make these approaches more inclusive by moving into what I have called the quasi-subjective modalities. In these views, the authority to confer artistic value on an object lies with different groups simultaneously. A work is art if at least one group of people decides that it is. For the purposes of conferring this authority, this group can be based on anything: race, nationality, gender, affinity, etc. If collectively all or most of the members of a group value something as art, then it is art, although this valuation is only binding for people who are a part of the group. These approaches are even more flexible than quasi-objective approaches, but they do start to drift further from the common understanding of what art is and how it should be valued. There is also the question of how to handle the changing makeup of groups over time, and what should happen when the values of two or more groups that a person belongs to conflict with one another. The only way to be sure that everyone is correct in each of their judgments about art is to adhere to a strictly subjective interpretation of the question, what is art? In these subjective approaches, valuation of an object or work is entirely on the person viewing that object or work. If they say that it's art, then it is. If they say that it's not, then for them, it's not. What they decide has no bearing on whether something is or is not art for someone else, only for themselves. A wholly subjective approach sidesteps the question of authority entirely, and better reflects the diversity of individual taste we seem to experience in casual conversation. However, standards can be fleeting, and it's hard to have coherent conversations about art as a broader subject when there are so few common threads. As we've seen, all of the approaches have their benefits and drawbacks. There is not one clear, correct answer to the question we've posed, unless, of course, it's entailed by other ontological or epistemological realities we have already committed ourselves to. In fact, there are some anti-essentialist theories which say that the question is not worth answering at all. They're uninterested in defining art. For some, like Wittgenstein, it's because it's an impossible task. A sufficiently complex definition of art that accounted for all possibilities would be too unwieldy to be a useful tool. For others, like most Marxist philosophers, the question is either unimportant or nonsensical. Artistic value is not an ontological reality. Art's real function is ideological and political, not philosophical. Whatever approach you find the most convincing, and whichever lens you choose to apply to your own work, it's important to keep these different approaches in mind when evaluating the work of others. If an author is explicit in the approach they're taking, it's easy to see whether their argument follows sound logic. If they don't say, then figuring it out from their other arguments will help with understanding why they may be arguing from the position they've taken. The question of who decides what is art does not come up often, but it underpins all philosophical discussion about art and is always worth considering.